The US snagged Alaska for just $7.2 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $140 million today, roughly 2 cents an acre for 586,412 square miles of land. While Russia mourns lost ground, the US thrives. But what if this cold gamble turned out to be the biggest mistake in America's history? In the early 1800s, Russia had a small colonial foothold in North America. However, Alaska remained sparsely populated, even by Russians themselves. By the 1860s, there were only about 800 Russian settlers in the territory. The land was remote, rugged, and increasingly difficult to justify holding on to. After Russia's crushing defeat in the Crimean War, which cost over 450,000 lives and exposed a major weakness in the Russian military, Tsar Alexander II began to see Alaska less as an asset and more as a liability, especially in the event of another conflict with Britain, which could easily seize the territory. With tensions cooling in the aftermath of the American Civil War, Russia quietly opened the door to negotiations. William H. Seward, the U.S. Secretary of State, saw an opportunity. He began talks with Russian envoy Edward de Sturkel, and after careful bargaining, the two sides reached an agreement. On March 30th, 1867, they signed a treaty that would transfer Alaska to the United States, a move that would later prove far more strategic than anyone imagined at the time. At the time, most Americans were baffled by the decision. To them, Alaska looked like a little more than a cold, remote, and utterly useless wasteland. Critics slammed the deal as a reckless waste of money, claiming the US had splurged $7.2 million on a chunk of ice no one would ever want to live in. Newspapers had a field day, ridiculing the purchase as a foolish gamble. They called it everything from Seward's icebox to Seward's folly, convinced it would drain government funds and offer nothing in return. At just 2 cents an acre, about 36 cents today when adjusted for inflation, the United States had pulled off a massive land acquisition, adding an area roughly 1/5 the size of the entire continental US. Following the purchase, nearly all of the Russian settlers packed up and left, leaving Alaska quietly and largely empty for years to come. For decades, the region remained remote and sparsely populated, with a little to draw settlers, that is until gold was discovered in the late 1890s. This triggered the Klondike Gold Rush, which brought over 100,000 prosecutors to the region and changed everything. Russian America got its start with the Promyshleniki, rugged fur trappers and merchants who had already pushed their way across Siberia. By 1732, they had reached Alaska's shores, drawn by the promise of rich fur resources. In 1799, the Russian-American company, RAC, was granted an official charter to control the fur trade in the region. Although no permanent colony was firmly established, the Russian Orthodox Church sent missionaries to work among Alaska's native peoples, building churches and trying to spread their faith. Despite the enormous size of the territory, more than twice the size of Texas, only about 700 Russians were ever stationed there, attempting to assert control and maintain Russia's presence in this remote part of the world. In 1821, Tsar Alexander I took a bold step by issuing an edict claiming Russian sovereignty over the Pacific coast of North America, north of the 51st parallel. The decree also banned foreign ships from coming within 100 Italian miles. It turned out to be an aggressive move that didn't sit well with the United States. U.S. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams pushed back hard, viewing the edict as a threat to American commerce and westward expansion. Looking to preserve diplomatic ties with the U.S., Russia backed down. In the Russo-American Treaty of 1824, Russia agreed to scale back its territorial claims to lands north of the 5440 parallel and to open its ports to American ships. By the 1850s, Russian America was becoming more of a burden than a benefit. The once thriving sea otter population, valued for its luxurious fur, had been hunted nearly to extinction, with only a fraction, that is, fewer than 2,000, remaining out of an estimated 300,000 in the late 18th century. The fur trade, which had justified Russia's presence in Alaska for decades, was collapsing. At its peak, a single sea otter pelt could sell for the equivalent of over $1,000 in today's dollars on the Chinese market. At the same time, Russia was in desperate need for money after suffering a crushing defeat in the Crimean War at the hands of Britain and France. The war, which lasted from 1853 to 1856, resulted in an estimated 450,000 military and civilian lives lost and severely strained the imperial treasury, leading to increased debt and economic stagnation. The growing presence of American and Canadian settlers in the region also made the Russian economy feel increasingly vulnerable. The California Gold Rush had already shown how quickly Americans could flood into a territory. Between 1848 and 1588, California's population ballooned from about 14,000 to over 300,000. And if that happened in Alaska, Russia's small outpost wouldn't stand a chance. But the real concern wasn't gold. It was Britain. Alaska's proximity to British-controlled Canada made it a strategic liability. In any future war, Russia knew it wouldn't be able to defend the territory against British forces. Worse, they feared losing it to their longtime rival for nothing. To avoid that outcome, Emperor Alexander II began seriously considering a sale. Negotiations with the Russian government picked up in 1857 and 1858. The idea was to offer Alaska to the United States, not only to rid Russia of a defenseless colony, but also to ensure that the British wouldn't end up right on Russia's doorstep across the Bering Sea. At its narrowest point, the Bering Strait is just 55 miles, that is 88 kilometers wide, underscoring the vulnerability of Russian territory to British encroachment. Grand Duke Konstantin, the Tsar's younger brother, became a vocal supporter of the plan. In a memo to Foreign Minister Alexander Gorchakov, he argued that it was time to let go of Siberia and hand it over to a power better positioned to hold it. It didn't matter so long as the power wasn't Britain. Although the US showed some interest, the growing threat of civil war put any negotiations on hold. Washington had other priorities, and Alaska would have to wait. Between 1859 and 1861, tensions in the United States escalated rapidly, leading to the outbreak of the Civil War in April 1861. The conflict would claim more than 620,000 lives and consume national attention and resources for 4 years. In 1857, momentum was building within the Russian Empire to part ways with its distant and increasingly unprofitable colony in North America. At that time, Russian America generated less than 100,000 rubles annually in profit for the Russian-American Company, a figure dwarfed by the costs of maintaining and defending the territory. During the winter 1859 to 1860, behind closed doors in Washington, quiet discussions began to take shape. Russian diplomat Eduard de Sterkel, although officially instructed not to mention selling Alaska, began exploring US officials anyway. He maintained a casual tone, primarily speaking with Assistant Secretary of State John Appleton and Senator William M. Gwin of California. What he heard in return was that the Americans were interested. While President James Buchanan wasn't ready to make anything official, he allowed these informal conversations to continue. At one point, Sterkel casually asked Gwin what the US might be willing to pay for Russian America. Gwin floated a figure of $5 million, but back in St. Petersburg, Foreign Minister Gorchakov balked. That number was far too low, not even close to what Russia had in mind. When Sterkel relayed Gorchakov's reaction, Gwin assured him that a higher price wouldn't be a problem. Despite the promising signals, the timing couldn't have been worse. President Buchanan's administration was losing favor quickly, and the country was edging towards crisis. In the meantime, Sterkel proposed renewing the charter of the Russian-American Company. Originally chartered in 1799 and renewed in 1821, the company's profits had declined sharply, with sea otter pelt exports dropping from over 20,000 annually in the early 1800s to fewer than 2,000 by the 1850s. To breathe new life into the struggling colony, he suggested opening 2 of its ports to foreign trade and establishing commercial ties with Peru and Chile. Both became emerging markets for Pacific trade, with Chilean exports to North America increasing by over 300% between 1850 and 1870. The hope was to give the enterprise a fresh jolt, at least until the time was right to revisit the question of selling Alaska. Even as the sale of Alaska stalled during the American Civil War, Russia continued to see a strategic advantage in handling the territory over to the United States. One of their key motivations was geopolitical. By transferring Alaska, they could help box in British Columbia and potentially weaken British influence in the Pacific Northwest. At the time, British Columbia's population was just over 50,000, heavily concentrated in Victoria and Fraser Valley, and it relied on tenuous connections to the British Empire. If British holdings ended up surrounded by American territory, Russia believed it would shift the balance of power. After an intense all-night negotiation session, the treaty was signed at 4 a.m. on March 30th, 1867. It was sold for $7.2 million, equivalent to about $140 million today. At just 2 cents per acre, the deal added an enormous swath of land to the United States, stretching across 586,000 square miles. When the US bought Alaska from Russia, many Americans were suspicious. some thought the deal had been shady. However, just a few years later, in 1872, naturalist W. H. Dall noted that most Americans supported the purchase. Fast forward over a century, and one historian pointed out that the idea that Americans hated the Alaska deal has become one of the most persistent myths in US history. Presently, the state of Alaska has a population of 742,499, having grown an annualized 0.3% over the 5 years to 2025, which ranks it 37th out of all 50 US states by growth rate. Alaska's gross state product, GSP, in 2025 reached $55.8 billion, with growth of 2.1% over the 5 years to 2025. Business in Alaska employed a total of 345,201 people, with average annual employment growth over the past 5 years of 2.7%. The top 3 sectors by total employment are transportation and warehousing, mining and real estate, and rental and leasing. These sectors contributed the most to Alaska's GDP in 2025, representing a combined 45.6% of the state's GDP. The healthcare and social assistance, retail trade, and transportation and warehousing sectors contributed the most to employment in Alaska in 2025, representing a combined 37.2% of state employment. Still, not everyone agrees that it was a good financial move. Economist David R. Barker argued that, from a purely federal government perspective, Alaska hasn't paid off. He pointed out that the tax revenue and resource royalties collected by the US government have fallen short of covering the cost of governing the state, especially considering the interest on the money borrowed to buy it. Barker's 2009 paper estimated that federal spending in Alaska far outweighed revenues collected, with the state receiving roughly $1.84 in federal funding for every dollar it contributed in taxes. Taking that view even further, analyst John M. Miller claimed that the oil companies operating in Alaska didn't earn enough profit to justify the financial risks they took on when developing the region's petroleum industry. Even though the Prudhoe Bay oil field discovered in 1968 has produced over 13 billion barrels of oil, Miller argued that the infrastructure and logistical challenges reduced overall profitability. Eventually, Alaska proved to be far more than the icy wilderness skeptics once mocked. Over time, it revealed itself as a land filled with natural resources, including gold, silver, zinc, copper, and some of the most valuable fisheries. Today, Alaska's seafood industry is worth over $5.7 billion annually and accounts for more than 60% of all wild-caught seafoods in the US. But its worth isn't just economic. Alaska's strategic location, nestled between Russia and the rest of North America, made it a critical military stronghold during World War II and the Cold War. The Aleutian Islands Campaign, 1942 to 1943, marked the only World War II battles fought on US soil. By the 1950s, Alaska hosted over 60 US military installations due to its proximity to the Soviet territory. Today, Alaska continues to play a major role in the US economy. It's a powerhouse of energy production, home to roughly 3.4 billion barrels in proven oil reserves, and a reminder that what once seemed like a gamble turned out to be one of the most valuable land deals in American history. The United States bought Alaska because it didn't want its common adversary, Britain, to acquire it. What was once described as a wasteland is today a major source of income for Americans. What do you think? Let us know in the comments if you enjoyed this video, and please ensure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, and we will see you in the next video.